For 8 days, neighbors heard her screams. For 8 days, no one called 911. For 8 days, Princesa Encarnacion-Soto was tortured in an apartment where police had already responded to 22 domestic violence calls in a single year. And when it was over, her body, beaten, stabbed, and mutilated, was dumped in a stairwell like garbage. The system didn't just fail Princesa. It abandoned her completely. Princesa Encarnacion-Soto was just 21 years old when she agreed to meet her ex-boyfriend Robert Strother in the Bronx. What followed wasn't just a murder. It was a systematic breakdown of every protection that should have saved her life. A mother lost her only daughter. A community was left in shock. And a killer was allowed to operate in plain sight, in an apartment already known to authorities as a hotbed of violence. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Anatomy, where we examine not just crimes, but the systems that fail victims. In this episode of the Crime Anatomy, we'll walk you through the exact timeline of Princessa's captivity. The days she spent bound with rope while being beaten with hammers and slashed with knives. You'll hear about the neighbors who heard her cries but did nothing. You'll learn about the 22 domestic violence calls to that same building that should have triggered intervention. And most disturbingly, you'll discover how Strother's own mother allegedly helped conceal the crime, changing Princessa's clothes and bleaching away her blood after the murder. This isn't just another true crime story. This is a case study in how domestic violence victims are failed at every level, and what must change to prevent the next Princessa from suffering the same fate. Before we continue, if you find value in these investigations that expose systemic failures, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the Crime Anatomy. Your support helps us bring these critical stories to light. Now let's look at the woman behind the headlines and the life that was stolen from her.
Details emerging in a murder investigation in the Bronx. Detectives looking for the boyfriend of a woman they say was stabbed and tortured for more than a week in Fordham. Investigators believe 21-year-old Princesa Encarnacion-Soto was tied to a bed, attacked with a hammer, and stabbed, and then thrown down a stairwell. Meanwhile, the boyfriend's mother is under arrest and facing murder charges. 54-year-old Naida Jorge was arrested after detectives noticed a trail of blood coming from her.
Princesa Encarnacion-Soto was born and raised in Rhode Island, the only daughter of Jesse Soto. Those who knew her described her as adored and full of promise, a young woman whose name, Princessa, perfectly captured how precious she was to her family. Her roots extended to the Dominican Republic, where much of her extended family still lives today. This cultural connection shaped her identity and values, creating strong bonds that stretched across borders. Despite the distance, she maintained close ties with both her American and Dominican relatives, embodying the strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you come from. What made Princessa remarkable wasn't just her warm personality or her close family bonds. It was her courage to build something new. She had moved from Rhode Island to New York, leaving the safety of her mother's home to forge her own path. Friends remember her as friendly and optimistic, someone who approached life with genuine enthusiasm and plans for her future. The relationship between Princessa and her mother Jessie was especially profound. They spoke frequently, with Jessie later recalling their final conversation during a Mother's Day visit, a memory she now clings to through tears. "She was my only child," Jessie would later tell reporters, her voice breaking. "My everything." This wasn't a woman who lived in isolation or without support. Princessa had people who loved her, who worried about her, who would have done anything to protect her. But as we'll see, love alone cannot shield someone from a system designed to fail them. What makes Princessa's story so devastating is precisely this contrast between the strength of her family bonds and the complete abandonment by the systems meant to protect her, between the promise of her future and the brutality of its theft. At 18, Princessa began dating Robert Strother. What started as a normal relationship would, over the course of 3 years, transform into something far more sinister. Those close to Princessa noticed the red flags early. The relationship was marked by volatility, frequent arguments, jealousy, and tension that seemed to escalate over time. Her mother and friends worried, sensing that beneath the surface of typical relationship problems lurked something more dangerous. There was always this feeling that things could explode, One friend later told investigators. He would get so angry over nothing, and Princessa would try to calm him down. The pattern is familiar to domestic violence experts. Isolation, control, and escalating emotional abuse that serves as a precursor to physical violence. For Princessa, the breaking point came several months before her death, when she finally ended the relationship. This is where we must pause to acknowledge a critical fact about domestic violence. The most dangerous time for a victim is not during the relationship, when they attempt to leave. Studies show that 75% of domestic homicides occur during or after separation. The abuser, having lost control, becomes desperate to reassert it, often with deadly consequences. After the breakup, Princessa largely moved on with her life. She maintained occasional contact with Strother through social media, perhaps believing the worst was behind her. This, too, follows a common pattern. Abusers often maintain a connection, waiting for an opportunity to regain access to their victim. That opportunity came in mid-July 2025, when Princessa agreed to meet with Strother, possibly seeking reconciliation or closure. On July 11th, she traveled from Rhode Island to New York, arriving at his apartment at 2295 Grand Concourse in the Fordham Heights neighborhood of the Bronx. Friends would later express deep regret that they hadn't recognized how dangerous this meeting could be. But the truth is, Princessa couldn't have known what awaited her. She couldn't have known that Strother had allegedly been planning her murder, that his intentions were premeditated and malicious. She couldn't have known that she was walking into a trap from which she would never escape. I'd like to pause here and ask, have you ever witnessed warning signs in a relationship, either your own or someone close to you, that made you concerned? What were they? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else recognize danger before it's too late. What happened next was not just one man's cruelty. It was a chain of failures stretching from neighbors to the very systems meant to protect victims like Princessa. When she arrived in New York and went to stay at her ex-boyfriend's apartment on Grand Concourse, the same one he shared with his mother, Naida Jorge, there was no sign that her visit would end in horror. But within days, everything changed. Investigators later determined that soon after she entered that apartment, Princessa was restrained with rope. What followed was more than a week of captivity and violence, a living nightmare that unfolded behind closed doors while the world outside carried on. Throughout that week, residents in the building heard screams, loud banging, and cries echoing from the apartment. One neighbor later told police, "It sounded like someone was being hurt. We heard it multiple times." Yet not a single 911 call was made. This silence was not new. Police records revealed that the same building had already seen 22 domestic violence calls in the previous year alone, 2 of which had been made by Naida Jorge herself, reporting her son's violent behavior. Each call had been an opportunity for intervention, each one a warning sign that went unheeded. As the days passed, small details hinted at what was happening inside. A neighbor noticed Strother acting strangely, pacing the hallway and glancing nervously toward the stairwell. Another heard what sounded like furniture being thrown, followed by a woman's cries. A delivery worker even saw blood in the hallway and mentioned it to the building superintendent, who dismissed it as probably paint. By the time Princessa's cries weakened to faint whimpers, the torture had already stretched on for days. And then came the final assault. Strother allegedly stabbed her repeatedly, struck her with a hammer, and inflicted injuries that the medical examiner would later describe as signs of prolonged, deliberate torture: stab wounds, blunt force trauma, slits beneath her feet, and fractured knuckles. But even in death, her suffering wasn't over. That same evening, Strother and his mother allegedly began cleaning the apartment, scrubbing blood, changing her clothes, and discarding evidence in garbage bags. Surveillance footage later captured Jorge carrying the bags out of the building. Then, in a final act of dehumanization, Princessa's body was dumped in the third-floor stairwell of the Bronx apartment, left where anyone could find her. The next morning, a neighbor discovered her lifeless body while taking out trash. Horrified, they called 911, finally setting in motion the investigation that should have begun days earlier. Strother fled soon after, sparking a week-long manhunt. Detectives pieced together surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence until they cornered him near the same building where he'd taken her life. His arrest ended the search, but not the outrage. Because beyond the brutality itself, this case revealed something deeper. How many chances there were to save her. 22 prior domestic violence calls. Screams heard by multiple neighbors. A hallway marked with blood. Each one was a red flag, and each was ignored. What unfolded in that apartment wasn't just one tragedy. It was the result of silence, neglect, and systemic failure. Now, I want to ask you, what do you think? Would your local community or law enforcement have acted differently if they'd heard those screams? Tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. In the aftermath of Princessa's murder, the fight for justice began. But for her loved ones, no verdict could ever truly balance the scale of what was lost. Robert Strother and his mother, Naida Jorge, were both arrested and charged with a long list of crimes that read like a record of horror. 2 counts of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, first-degree manslaughter first, and second-degree kidnapping, criminal possession of a weapon, concealment of a human corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and first-degree hindering prosecution. Their arraignment took place on August 18, 2025, before Bronx Supreme Court Justice Darlene Goldberg. Both pleaded not guilty and were remanded in custody. The Bronx District Attorney's Office, led by Assistant District Attorney Jonathan Vega of the Homicide Bureau, is prosecuting the case. Their next court appearance is scheduled for November 13, 2025. If convicted, both face the possibility of life in prison without parole. But even as the case moved through the justice system, one truth echoed through the Bronx community. No legal sentence could undo 8 days of silence that ended in death. Princessa's death didn't just shake her family. It haunted an entire neighborhood. Residents of Fordham Heights, who had once passed Strother's apartment without a second thought, now replayed the sounds they'd ignored. The banging, the cries, the quieting voice that had faded night after night. Many began asking the same painful question. How did we realize what was happening? The shock quickly turned into guilt. A few neighbors admitted they had heard something but didn't think it was serious. Others said they feared getting involved. Those hesitations now carried unbearable weight. Her murder exposed not only the cruelty of one man, but the collapse of a community safety net that should have caught her long before her final moments. Princessa's mother, Jessie Soto, became the voice her daughter no longer had, standing before cameras at a press conference. Her voice trembled with grief, but also fury. "The system failed my daughter," she said through tears. "How many calls does it take before someone's life matters?" Her words weren't just directed at the justice system. They were aimed at all of us. Because what happened to Princessa wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a reflection of a much larger pattern. One where warning signs are dismissed, victims are left unprotected, and bystanders convince themselves that someone else will act. In the months following her death, community leaders and advocacy groups began to turn outrage into action. Organizations like the Freedom Youth Family Justice Center used Princessa's story as a rallying cry. They pushed for more responsive systems, ones that treat domestic violence reports as interconnected, not isolated events. They called for real accountability, improved tracking for addresses with repeated domestic complaints, faster cross-agency communication, and mandatory welfare checks after multiple reports from the same location. Princessa's case, they argued, exposed how bureaucracy and complacency can become silent accomplices to abuse. If there's one thing her death has shown, it's that small actions or inactions can mean the difference between life and loss. First, her story reminds us to recognize and respond to warning signs early. When violence escalates after breakup, when someone becomes isolated or fearful, those aren't private matters. They're red flags. Waiting for proof can be deadly. Second, rapid response must become a priority. 22 previous domestic calls linked to the same building should never have been treated as routine. Every call, every scream, should be a signal for urgent intervention, not another forgotten report. Third, support for vulnerable individuals must extend beyond geography. Princessa had recently traveled from the Dominican Republic to New York, far from her roots and the people who might have intervened. Victims living away from their home communities often lack access to local help. leaving them trapped in dangerous relationships with nowhere to turn. Fourth, empowering bystanders could save lives. The bystander effect, that dangerous assumption that someone else will handle it, remains one of the deadliest social habits. Reporting suspected abuse isn't meddling, it's protection. One phone call could have changed Princessa's fate. And finally, supporting survivors and families after tragedy is part of justice, too. For people like Jessie Soto, justice doesn't end in court. It continues through advocacy, awareness, and ensuring that her daughter's name stands for something more than suffering. As the case moves toward trial, the echoes of Princessa's story continue to ripple far beyond New York. Domestic violence advocates, lawmakers, and police departments across the country have begun re-evaluating how they handle repeated calls and high-risk offenders. Her story is prompting difficult but necessary questions. Why are patterns of violence still missed despite modern data systems? Why are cries for help still ignored in densely populated areas where someone always hears something? Princesa Encarnacion-Soto's life, though brief, is now forcing a national reckoning. If there's any light to be found in the darkness of this case, it's in what comes next. The push for stronger community intervention, improved domestic violence tracking, and the empowerment of victims and neighbors alike all stem from the lessons she left behind. Princessa wasn't just a statistic or another headline. She was a daughter, a mother, a young woman with dreams that were brutally stolen. Her story is now a call to action, a reminder that protecting the vulnerable is everyone's responsibility. If you found this case powerful and believe her story deserves to be heard, please subscribe to the Crime Anatomy and share this episode. Each story we tell here is not just about what happened. It's about what should never happen again. Because behind every statistic is a name. Behind every tragedy is a family. And behind every silence is a choice, to look away or to act. This is the Crime Anatomy. And remembering Princessa means refusing to let silence win again.